Tech chasing is one of the most important concepts to understand in Melee, especially for beginners, as it allows you to extend combos more consistently. This video explores the basics of tech chasing in Melee and addresses common mistakes players make while learning the game. I'll make a more advanced tech chasing guide at a later date, but for now this video will cover the basics. To understand what tech chasing is, we need to understand what teching is. Teching is a defensive option primarily used to break a character's fall and is performed by pressing the L or R buttons just as you come into contact with the floor. If done correctly, you'll bounce from the ground into a standing animation, allowing you to continue fighting. If you're holding left or right while you press L or R, you'll do a tech roll instead, and will roll in the direction that you're holding. The reason teching is particularly useful is because you are invincible during a portion of the tech animation, which can allow you to escape an opponent's combo. On top of this, by rolling away instead of landing in place, you can create enough distance between you and the opponent to escape the situation entirely. So in order to successfully tech in Melee, you need to hit the floor between 1 to 20 frames after you press the L or R button. If you hit the floor between 21 to 40 frames after this, you'll miss the tech entirely. 20 frames is actually a pretty huge window in Smash, but it can be abused by tech trapping, which we'll cover in a different video. So tech chasing is simply chasing your opponent's tech option in order to follow up with a combo. With this in mind, the first step to successfully tech chasing in Melee is to understand the tech options that your opponent has. Prior to hitting the ground, your opponent has 4 options: tech away, tech behind, tech in place, and miss tech. However, if they miss the tech, they can then get up attack, stand up in place, or roll away/behind. Tech chasing generally works by either covering these options on reaction, which isn't always possible depending on the situation or character, or guessing which tech option they'll choose and covering that. One of the most common examples of a tech chase is Sheik's down throw tech chase on Fox, Falcon, and Falco. Here Sheik can react to each option on the ground, but she could also just guess which option her opponent will use and cover it that way. I use the phrase guess instead of read because a read really is just a more informed guess. So if you notice your opponent overuses an option, you can assume they'll do it and cover that option under that assumption. However, even if you know what direction they'll tech, sometimes you're not in a position to cover it, but it's much more common in Melee to be able to cover the option if you know it's coming, so keep this in mind while playing. With all of that out of the way, let's look at some common mistakes players make and show how to fix them. These mistakes are mistiming their follow-up, not understanding whether their opponent can tech, not understanding how to cover options efficiently, and not understanding whether you can tech chase on reaction. Let's start with number 1, mistiming their follow-up. The most common mistake beginners make when tech chasing by far is not timing their attacks correctly. I believe this habit develops because beginners are used to playing against people who do not tech at all, and immediately attacking is a great way to punish no tech. However, this habit quickly backfires because teching gives you invincibility frames for a portion of the animation. So if you attack while they're invincible, you won't hit them, and the lag of your mistimed move usually allows your opponent to escape the situation entirely. Because of this, to punish the majority of tech options, you need to time your moves to cover the frames where the character is not invincible. Thankfully, the amount of time or frames that a character is invincible in Melee after a tech in place or tech roll is quite consistent. Without getting too technical, no pun intended, the first half of a tech roll is invincible and the second half is not. The only difference with tech rolls is how far each character rolls away, which obviously does make it harder to follow up, but that can depend heavily on your positioning. More on that later. Practically speaking, all you need to do to cover a tech roll is wait until their initial invincibility is over in the first half of the animation and attack them. By switching your timing from immediately attacking to waiting a bit and then attacking, you'll cover way more escape options. Covering a tech in place, however, can be a bit trickier, but still follows similar principles. Every character in Melee takes 26 frames to perform a tech in place, and the majority of characters are invincible between frames 1 to 20. The only exception to this is Pikachu and Pichu, who are invincible from frames 1 to 24. This means that you have at least 6 frames of end lag to hit most characters, but this number is actually bigger if you consider what their follow-up options are. This is because pretty much every option in Melee has some form of startup lag, even something simple like jumping, so the amount of time you have to punish could actually be quite a bit higher than 6 frames. Because of all this, as long as you position yourself correctly and time your attacks correctly, you'll be able to punish an opponent's tech option in the majority of situations. But what do I mean by positioning yourself correctly? Well, where you are and where your opponent is when they tech makes a huge difference. For example, many players are familiar with how difficult it can be to cover a Fox or Falco teching in place, as they can immediately shine on frame 1, making the window where they're vulnerable quite small. However, if you position yourself outside of the range of shine, it becomes significantly less threatening. This is even more true when your opponent is above you on a platform, as shine simply cannot hit you as the attacker. Positioning can also be more nuanced with regards to tech chasing. In a previous video on stage positioning, I covered how where you tech in place can have a big impact on how easy it is to cover certain options. For example, if you're in a corner, you have less space to tech roll away, making your roll shorter and easier to react to. And if you're on a platform, your roll can only extend within the length of the platform in the first place. In these situations, you can often cover many options with a single move, or turn an unreactable situation into a reactable one, which makes tech chasing a lot easier. Moving on to number 2, not knowing whether your opponent can tech in the first place. Another reason why players mistime their techs is because they don't actually know whether their opponent can tech in a specific situation. Since this is a beginner's guide, I'll only briefly cover the details, but teching a move is only possible if your opponent is in a state called tumble. Tumbling is an airborne state that a character may enter after being hit or pushed in certain ways. The most common reason a character enters this animation is due to being hit by a move, and the conditions for entering this state have to do with which move is used and the percent of your opponent. If you're fairly new to the game, a good rule of thumb is that most moves will not put your opponent into tumble state until low to mid percents, and this percent will be even higher if the opponent is grounded, as they have access to crouch canceling, and crouch canceling reduces knockback. However, I do try to avoid rules of thumb in general because there's always going to be situations where these rules don't apply, and sometimes those situations are quite common. For example, because Falco's Shine has a base knockback of 110, which is above 80, it will always put you into a tumble animation even if you're at 0%. This is what makes it such a good combo starter, and it's something you need to understand if you play as Falco or against Falco. Similarly, pretty much all down throws and up throws in the game will force you into a tumble state even at 0%, meaning you will need to tech if you hit the ground. This is why down throw tech chasing is even possible with characters like Sheik, Falcon, Marth, and more. Some moves also have what's called fixed knockback, where the knockback does not scale with the percent, meaning it will put you in the same animation regardless of what percent you're at. A great example of this is Fox's Shine, which is why wave shining works in the same way regardless of what percent you're at. With this in mind, moves with fixed knockback may never put the opponent in a tumble state even at super high percents, so you have to be aware of that in advance. Also, if you hit an opponent at a higher percent in the air, they can smash the stick to the left or right to exit the tumble animation or wiggle out as soon as hit stun is over. So as you play more, you'll get better at identifying whether or not your opponent is in tumble, meaning whether or not they can tech, both because the animation itself is quite recognizable and because you'll run into the same situations where tumble is relevant. Which leads us to number 3, not covering options efficiently. Many understand what tech chasing is, but haven't thought critically about which moves to use when tech chasing in the first place. Specifically, I don't think players are mindful enough of the risk versus reward decision that comes up a lot in tech chase scenarios. Just because a move covers a tech option doesn't automatically mean it's the best move in that situation. A good example of this is when you have a strong read on an opponent's tech option, as you can opt to go for a riskier follow-up to get more value, rather than a safe option that covers more options but has less reward. In some cases, the seemingly risky option is also still possible on reaction, so I strongly recommend you consider this while playing, or watch a replay of your games to see whether the options you're choosing are actually optimal. Things like positioning, percents, and stages all factor into how you should approach your follow-ups, so as always, watch videos of pro players or ask experienced players to learn which options work in different scenarios. On to number 4, not knowing whether you can tech chase on reaction. Many players mistakenly believe that you can react to many or even all situations, and this is often either completely untrue or just very impractical. While it is true that many fast characters have common situations where they can indeed react to all options, you shouldn't just assume that the majority of situations are reactable, especially if you're playing a character that's generally kind of slow. It's kind of funny because this mistake often ends up looking like the opposite of the problem that we covered earlier. In this case, the player tries to wait and react to the opponent's tech option, which is basically what I recommended earlier, but they don't recognize that in this scenario, the only way to cover certain options is just to guess that the opponent's going to do it in the first place. This situation is particularly common with slow characters like Peach, where a tech roll away, for example, might be punished most effectively by immediately moving into position to punish that roll, as Peach would be too slow to get there in time if she tried to wait and react. Again, this does depend on positioning, but try to identify where these situations might occur, and if you're unsure, it's always better to confidently cover one option rather than assuming you can react to an option and end up covering nothing. This mistake can also happen if the player adds an unnecessary movement or move to the sequence that just doesn't need to be there. By doing this, players can turn a reactable situation into an unreactable one, or even make it impossible to follow up on the option altogether. Sometimes this is solved by simply removing the wasteful movement and you're able to cover everything, but other times it's just a trade-off. An example of this might be Falco trying to cover a roll out of shield to cover something like a buffered roll away. Falco can't afford to pressure with Shine and must wave dash or dash after the aerial in order to follow up. However, by doing this, he is compromising his shield pressure in other ways, which is why the situation requires a read to punish it and not just a reaction. So while covering a role is not necessarily a tech chase, it follows the same principles, and this example still applies to tech chase scenarios. And that's it for the video. In a future video, I'll cover more nuanced tech chasing details like using crouch canceling, covering and using slide off DI, and other advanced techniques. So subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when that content is live. Also, if you want to support my channel, the best way to do that is through Patreon. I'll now be releasing my videos one day before they go live to anyone who's a supporter, and will also be making exclusive behind the scenes content that's only available to patrons. I'm even going to be playing patrons on Netplay if they want, so if any of that interests you, check out the link on screen or in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.